Welcome. Appreciate all of you coming this evening. This is a public meeting to discuss Morton's drinking water. We intend for this to be an informative meeting where we'll give a water system overview, an update on our compliance commitment agreement with the IEPA, an update on our recent copper action level exceedance, and the steps we have taken to date and the steps we will continue to take to improve water quality. This meeting is scheduled for 2 hours. It is being videotaped for public record, so we will conclude the meeting at 8 p.m. I do anticipate that representatives here and myself will be available after the meeting if anyone has any follow-up questions after the meeting and after the tape is ended if we have questions. We will begin the meeting after I'm done here with a presentation by Teresa O'Grady from Crawford, Murphy & Tilley, and we'll conclude with questions and comments from the audience. If you know that you want to ask questions at the end of the presentation, if you would, I think Brad's got a sign-up sheet there. If you wouldn't mind, if you came here tonight and you wanted to speak, if you would sign that. It doesn't mean that the others won't be allowed to speak, but I would like to give an opportunity to those who showed up wanting to speak tonight. At this point, I would like to have everyone sitting alongside me here to introduce themselves and explain who they represent tonight, starting with Teresa.
My name is Teresa O'Grady. I'm with Crawford, Murphy & Tilley. We're a consulting engineering firm who has been helping the village for over 30 years. Me personally have been working with the village for the past 14 years on various water modeling and water issues.
I'm Steve Vance with the Illinois EPA Springfield Regional Office in the Public Drinking Water section. Been a field engineer, been with the EPA for 22 years and a field engineer for 18.
Dave McMillan, and I don't know who any of these people are. I don't know what I'm doing. No, I'm with the drinking water program. I manage the Division of Public Water Supplies. I've been with the Illinois EPA for 32 years. The first part of that time was spent in the Peoria Regional Office, and then I moved to Springfield. So I'm familiar with your community, and I appreciate the invitation to come and address you tonight.
My name is Craig Loudermilk. First and foremost, I've lived in this community most of my life, since first grade, and I am fortunate to be the Director of Public Works here at the Village of Morton for the past 6 years.
I'm Bob Burton. I've been employed by the Village of Morton for 42 years, the last 3 as a water treatment superintendent.
I'm Trent Reed. I'm the lab director at the Village of Morton. I've worked here for 10 years and lab director as 2 years.
Paul Ullman, the water distribution superintendent for the Village of Morton. I've been in water distribution for 25 years here at the village.
Thank all of you for being here. I would like to specifically thank Dave and Steve for being here. While they're the regulatory authority over Morton's public water system, they've always accepted our invitation, whether that's a public meeting or whatever, and they've always been there to assist us. So thank you for coming tonight. I would like to take the time to recognize some of the board members in the audience. If you wouldn't mind standing up, just so I could recognize you guys. I think quite a few of you are here tonight. Mayor Kaufman just walked in, so if you wouldn't mind standing just for a second. Thank you. I appreciate all of your attendance tonight, and I want to personally thank you for supporting us in the past and going forward. It makes it a lot easier for us to do our job when we know we have support of our board members so that we can focus on the real improvements that need to be made, and I thank everyone for that, past board members too. As most of you probably remember, the Village of Morton issued a precautionary citywide boil order on January 14, 2014. This boil order was the result of 8 monthly distribution samples that tested positive for coliform bacteria, which is an indicator that there could be a problem. 24 hours later, that boil order was lifted and the water was confirmed to be safe. While most people breathed a sigh of relief, we did not. Complacency has never been the standard in Morton, and it wasn't going to start on my watch in January 14, nor is it going to happen on Bob Burton's watch, as he was promoted to water treatment superintendent on April 1st of 2014. While Bob and I joked about him being promoted on April Fool's Day, There was no joke about what we were facing in the water treatment department. We began working immediately with the IEPA, all of these individuals sitting here, and our consultant, Crawford, Murphy, and Tilley, to identify potential problems and discuss possible solutions. In summary, we knew this would be a difficult road. We are now 3.5 years in since that citywide boil order, and I'm happy to report that we have made significant progress in our effort to improve water quality and continue to provide safe and reliable water throughout the village of Morton. With that, I would like to ask Teresa O'Grady to begin the presentation.
Thank you. Okay. So again, my name is Teresa O'Grady, Crawford, Murphy, and Tilley. I've been working with the village over the last 3.5 years through these items that I'm going to be talking about here right now. So to begin with, as Craig had indicated, first we're going to start with the water system overview, and then we're going to look at the update on the city's compliance commitment agreement with the IPA. We're going to have an update on the copper action level exceedance, steps the village has taken to improve water quality, as well as steps they will continue to take to improve water quality in the near future. So starting with the water system overview, a lot of residents, when they turn on the tap water, they just expect to have water coming out, but it does travel quite a distance, and there's a lot that goes into it to get it to the tap. So I just wanted to start with the water system overview to explain where the water is coming from. So the source of water for the village is shallow wells. There are wells 3 and 4 that discharge into water treatment plant number 1, wells 5, 6, and 7 that discharge into water treatment plant number 2, and then wells 8, 9, and 10 that discharge into water treatment plant number 3. Those are all operational right now, except well 8 is out of service for maintenance right now. Once the shallow well water is pumped out of the ground, it goes to these treatment plants where it is filtered through high pressure iron filters and softened through ion exchange units, as well as disinfected. And we'll get into that disinfection in a little bit here. But there's 3 water treatment plants, water treatment plant 1, 2, and 3. And from there, that water is then sent into the distribution system. And we'll talk about the distribution system in the next slide. But within the distribution system, there's storage. What comes out of the plant comes out at a constant rate. And then there's storage, elevated towers. I'm sure you've seen them. They look like little balls on top of tees. And they're 500,000 gallon. There's 3 of them. One on North Main Street, one on Detroit Street, and one on Veterans Parkway. And the water is stored in there. How that works is there's demand that happens in the system throughout the day, and that changes. As you can imagine, in the morning when people are showering and getting ready for work, there's a lot more demand than, let's say, 2 o'clock in the morning. The plants run better if they can run at a constant rate throughout the time that they're running. So during the day, as demand is greater than the flow being pumped out of the water treatment plants, the water comes from those storage tanks. If demand is less than what's being pumped into the system from the water treatment plants, then the extra water that's not being used goes into those storage tanks. So those storage tanks meet daily peaks in the system, as well as provide a reserve for fire protection. So as you're looking out and see those tanks throughout the system, that's providing the buffer and actually helping minimize pressure fluctuations within the system. And then we have the water distribution system. So the water distribution system is a looped network of pipes that bring the water from the plants and the tanks to the homes. These range in diameter from 4-inch up to 16-inch. And this map on the screen, and I know you can't see it really well, but it's a map of the looped network, and it's color-coded by diameter. So if you look at the dark blue is a 12-inch, the green is an 8-inch, the red is a 6-inch. So as the water is discharged into the system, depending on how far away you are from the water treatment plant, could impact the water quality that you're seeing because of the time it takes to get to your home, as well as then the water age that occurs. Because we've done through hydraulic modeling with the village, the water age goes up to as much as 5 to 7 days. So we need to make sure that the water quality is stable so that by the time it gets to your guys' taps, that it's still good water quality. So it makes it a little bit difficult because you want to loop the system so you don't have dead ends. If you have dead ends, you can have stagnant water, and that could reduce the water quality in the system. But as you can imagine, looping that almost doubles the amount of pipe you need in the system, and that increases the volume in the system and thus increases the water age. So it's a balancing act within the system to get the water to you guys. I know people who aren't in the industry, they turn on the water and they expect it there and good, clean, but there's a lot that goes into it. And I know these guys have been working hard for some as much as 40 years getting the water from these wells in the ground to the tap. So hopefully through that, maybe you guys have learned a little bit about the Morton system. But next I want to go into the update on the IEPA Compliance Commitment Agreement. So Morton received a violation notice for coliform positive samples and low chlorine residual in the distribution system on November 18, 2015. Through that process then, Morton entered into a Compliance Commitment Agreement, a CCA, with EPA in March of 2016, and it focused on two things: improving the stability of the water coming from the treatment plants, the finished water going out into the distribution system, as well as improving the water quality in the distribution system. So CCA improvements included the installation of mixing systems at the Detroit Street and Veterans Parkway elevated tanks. Those are the tanks we talked about. So the mixing system, as you can imagine, as water goes into those tanks, it goes up and down during the day. You know, it's the buffer for demand. So if there isn't a mixing system in there, the water that goes in comes out first. And so if the water doesn't turn over, you could get a higher water age occurring in the tanks. By mixing, it mixes the new water with the older water, so you have a better water quality or more distributed water quality coming out of the tanks. So that was the first improvement. Also, the CCA improvements included the installation of chlorine system improvements at the water treatment plants. And so that was a kind of twofold process. The plants were constructed, I believe, in the 60s. So as you can imagine, technology from 1960 to now is greatly different. So at that time, there wasn't the ability to do what we call flow pacing of chemical feed. So what we did with these improvements was allowed technology to catch up to the 2017 here, and flow pacing of chemical feed based on the ammonia in the water, and we'll talk about that in a minute, as well as the flow rate, and thus creating a stable chemistry coming out of the water treatment plants. So also with those improvements, the second part of that was allowing the village to go to breakpoint chlorination and to go to free chlorination, and again, we'll talk about that in a second. So the installation of the mixing systems in the elevated tanks was completed in July of 2016, and the chlorine system improvements at the 3 water treatment plants were completed in January of 2017, so about 5 or 6 months ago. Since that time, and we've been testing this. I say we because I've been working with the village folks here, but it's really Trent and Bob have been testing the chlorine decay. And the chlorine decay, they look at the chlorine in the water coming out of the plants, and they put it in a jar and cover it and put it in a area that doesn't see sunlight, and then they test it each day and they see how much chlorine has degraded over time. And initially, because the stability of the water was not the greatest, it didn't last very long. The chlorine didn't last very long. And as I said, the water distribution system is looped, and the outer reaches of the system can have a water age as much as 5 to 7 days. So you want that chlorine to last at least that 5 to 7 days so that you know your water can get to the far reaches of the system and still maintain chlorine residual. So I can tell you now, we just did the tests last week. The chlorine and finished water coming out of the plants has at least a 5-day chlorine residual, and it was still above 1 part per million, and you need a minimum of 0.5 part per million in the distribution system. So it was exceeding what our goal was here in these improvements. In addition, because of that and because of some of these other actions the village has been taking, the far outreaches of the system are still seeing that minimum 0.5 parts per million chlorine residual. So, which is a great improvement over the last 2 to 3 years, and these improvements are the result of that. So we still have a little bit to do on the CCA. There's status reports that are due October 1st and December 31st, and so that will complete the requirements that are in the current CCA. So as we talk about the compliance commitment agreement, one of the natural discussion points is why there's an issue with water quality in the distribution system. So I'm going to get a little bit technical here, so hopefully I'll try to explain it the best I can, but there's ammonia naturally occurring in the water. It's in the raw water, it's in the shallow well aquifers as it's pumped out and used and disinfected, and you add chlorine to the water to disinfect it. It's kind of like if you have a food and you're adding a preservative, you want to make sure that the water is still in good quality by the time it reaches the tap. So we disinfect it. As you add chlorine to a water that contains ammonia, it's going to create chloramines. There's 2 kinds of disinfectants, free chlorine and chloramines. If you have raw ammonia, you'll get chloramines. What happens is the chloramines that are created by adding chlorine are present, but we don't add enough chlorine to overcome all the raw ammonia. So part of the water going out in the system has raw ammonia, which is not harmful, it's fine to drink. The only problem it has is that it can cause what's called nitrification in the distribution system. And that's when ammonia-reducing bacteria degrades the ammonia and creates nitrates and nitrites. So in that process, a biofilm is created, and as then the water coming from the plants goes through that biofilm, it has a chlorine demand, and it takes away that residual that's in the water. So what happens is then you do not have your residual in the outskirts of the system because it's been eaten up by the biofilm that's in the system. So systems that have raw ammonia and they use chloramines for disinfection do what's called a chlorine burn. This is a normal practice that's done throughout the country. It's not just in Illinois. As we're looking into some guidance here, I found information in Texas even on nitrification-free chlorine burns and nitrification action plans. So what happens is the chlorine level is increased to the point where it does overcome the ammonia, and it's a large amount of chlorine, probably 5 to 6 times what the normal feed rate is, or more. And so it's not feasible to do that all the time. That would be way too much chlorine, high cost, but you overcome it through your breakpoint chlorination process, and it creates free chlorine. And that free chlorine will then attack the biofilm that's in the pipes, and through flushing, you can then remove that. So when you have nitrification in the system, the solution is to do these free chlorine burns and flushing. Hopefully people kind of understood that. So that's why there was some issues in the distribution system, but through the improvements that were done with the CCA, we can now address those. So the next steps, as I said, the current compliance commitment agreement goes through December 31st, 2017. We're going to monitor the system, make sure there's no more positive coliform samples and no low chlorine residual. If there is, then we do have to look at additional steps. The village will collect samples in the distribution system to monitor the nitrification process and then react through the chlorine burns and the flushing if nitrification is present. Additional evaluation and treatment could be required if either nitrification becomes too cumbersome and the village is flushing and doing these chlorine burns too much, or if the low chlorine residual and the positive coliform samples persist. So the additional treatment that would be evaluated would be removal of that ammonia. Because if we take that ammonia out of the treatment process, we then do not have the chloramination or the chloramine that's present, and we do not have the raw ammonia that's going into the finished water, and so it doesn't create the nitrification. So that could be a next step that we'll have to evaluate as we go further. So another part, there's a phase 2 of the chlorine system improvements that are going on, and just not specifically part of the CCA, but one of the things that is being done is the installation of chlorine scrubbers at the water treatment plants. And that's to, with chlorine gas, there's the potential for release, and so these chlorine scrubbers would neutralize that in the case of a release. So it's more for safety of not only the water treatment plant staff, but the people surrounding the plants. And that's currently under design and will be constructed in the next few months. So as I started out, we've talked about the update with the compliance commitment agreement, and now we go into the copper action level exceedance. And they're not related, but they have had impacts on each other. So with the copper action level exceedance, the village received notification of the copper action level exceedance on July 13th of 2016. And when there is a copper action level exceedance, through the regulation, then the village is mandated to do the list of things on here. And I'll let you read some of that, but a lot of it is collecting water samples, looking at the water samples, and that was done within 60 days. And then submitting source water treatment recommendations, submitting optimal corrosion control treatment recommendations and evaluations, and then looking at your optimal corrosion control treatment and submitting it to EPA for approval, and then installation of that and further monitoring. So, so far, samples were collected at the water treatment plants and in the distribution system and submitted to EPA in August of 2016. The source treatment recommendation and optimal corrosion control treatment, that's the OCCT recommendation, and daily entry point silicate and pH measurements were submitted in December of 2016. However, because we were still doing those CCA improvements with the chlorination system, we knew that even though we did the sampling and submitted it in August of 2016, it would be different. As we said, we were trying to get stability in the finished water through the CCA improvements. The CCA improvements weren't complete until January of 2017. So we wanted to make sure we were evaluating the optimal corrosion control treatment based on the finished water, the more stable finished water. So we had requested to EPA that we redo that sampling once the compliance commitment agreement improvements were complete, and then do the optimal corrosion control treatment evaluation and submit that recommendation. And so we're going to submit that in October 1st, 2017. We're currently evaluating corrosion control treatment, and that's being evaluated through either reducing the corrosivity of the water and also through the use of corrosion control treatment. Those are the two primary ways to mitigate high lead and copper levels. So corrosion control treatment is not a new thing. The village began feeding orthophosphate for corrosion control treatment in September 2012 as a result of NPDES limits at their wastewater treatment plant. So because of limits at the wastewater treatment plant, which the water that is being produced is going to the wastewater treatment plant, orthophosphate was fed as a corrosion inhibitor. So the village switched to sodium silicates for corrosion control in 2014 after it was suspected that the orthophosphate was promoting the nitrification in the distribution system. So there was a thought that the orthophosphate could be a nutrient for the ammonia-reducing bacteria, so we switched to sodium silicates for corrosion control. It doesn't appear that they're working as effectively as the orthophosphate. So as part of this optimal corrosion control treatment evaluation, we are looking at not only reducing the corrosivity of the water through pH adjustment and hardness adjustment, but we're looking at switching from sodium silicates to a blended phosphate, which is different than an orthophosphate, but it has a percent of orthophosphate in it, but it's a blended phosphate, so it's thought that it will not provide the nutrient to the ammonia-reducing bacteria in the distribution system. So we are looking at that right now as part of the optimal corrosion control treatment evaluation. So the next steps, the OCCT recommendation will be submitted by October 1st, 2017. Then the IEPA has 6 months to approve that, and that would take us to approximately April of 2018. After IEPA approval of it, we have 24 months to implement the recommended treatment. So that brings us to approximately April of 2020. And then after implementation of the optimal corrosion control treatment recommendation, the village then performs follow-up testing and monitoring of established water quality parameters for 12 months. So this is a long process. This will be going on past when the CCA is done. So that would bring us to then around April of 2021. So we're still continuing, and we will continue in this process. So I'm going to back up a step and talk about the lead and copper rule, because I know there's a lot of news media attention on lead and copper, and I want to provide you guys with information that reassures you and gives you some information to help improve water quality at your own homes. So the lead and copper rule was originally published in 1991. The rule sets action levels, and that's a key thing. They're not maximum contaminant levels. It's not MCLs. Action levels for lead of 15 parts per billion and copper of 1,300 parts per billion. If the number of samples greater than the action level is more than 10% of the samples, then there's an action level exceedance. So IEPA requires the village to test 60 locations every 6 months. and sample locations are based on the service, material, and installation date. There are no known lead services in the Village of Morton. That's a key thing to take away here. The village is not aware of any lead services. So we're focusing on copper with lead solder, and those are going into our sample sites and sample locations. Last sampling and testing for lead and copper was completed in May of 2017, so last month. And of the 60 locations tested, no locations exceeded the lead limit. And of the 60 locations tested, 13 locations exceeded the copper action level. So one thing to note, in the lead and copper rule, when you take the sample, it's a first draw sample. And that means you are taking it after the water has sat stagnant in your plumbing for at least 6 hours. So it's the absolute worst case situation. It would be not the normal time when you would drink the water and use the water for cooking. It's a possible condition if you don't take precautions, but as we're talking about that, just keep that in mind. 13 samples did, but it was after it sat in the pipes for 6 hours.
I'm sorry, but I just want to point out it was 23 locations, not 13.
Yeah, my data was showing 13, but we can
Yeah.
discuss that.
Consumer conference before, I just, yeah.
Teresa,
Yes.
it was 23 in 2016,
Okay.
13 in 2017.
Yes. So that's the difference.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So
Thank you, Trent.
the 13 levels was based on the May 2017 samples. So we get into the discussion that where does the copper come from? The copper is not present in the water that's coming from the plant. It comes from homes. It comes from residential plumbing. It is not present. If you go on the water mains, any of the hydrants, open up the hydrants and take a sample, the copper isn't present. It's happening within household plumbing. So it enters the water by dissolving from copper pipes in the plumbing anytime when the water is not used. So as the water is stagnant, sitting in the pipe, that is when the copper and lead can dissolve into the water. Knowing that is key in anything you do as far as taking precautions for both lead and copper, and overall general water quality within your homes. So one thing just to talk about is health effects of copper. For most people, copper is not a big deal. It's essential to life. You need it as you consume water and foods. Too much can upset your stomach. That's the main health effect. The human body has a natural mechanism for maintaining the proper level of copper, and if there is acute or chronic exposure, it can affect gastrointestinal system and the liver. One thing to note, though, is that many common foods actually far exceed the amount of copper that's in water. And I've listed a few up there, but raw oysters actually exceed it by 100 times. So you're getting much more copper from your foods than you are from water, even if it does exceed the action level. So who's at risk? Most people can maintain that, have that natural mechanism for maintaining proper level of copper. Children under 1 year old haven't developed that mechanism yet, so they are more vulnerable to the toxic effects of copper. And then people with 3 genetic diseases, Menkes disease, Wilson's disease, and idiopathic copper toxicosis, have trouble maintaining their copper. So they should, if they do have that disease, they should take precautions, whether it's with water or food or anything, for limiting their exposure to copper. So the next few slides delve into the fact that anytime the water sits in household plumbing, it can degrade. The water quality can degrade because it's in contact with the plumbing, and lead and copper can come out. It also can lose its chlorine residual there. So if you take nothing away from this, just keep in mind, if the water has sat overnight, or if you go on vacation, the water that's sitting in your pipes, you shouldn't be drinking right away or using for food preparation. What you should do is flush the water. Run the water in the morning when you wake up. If you wake up first thing and you take a drink of water, before you do that, run the water for 2 to 3 minutes. Allow the water to get cold. Then you know what you are drinking is not the stagnant water in the pipes. It is what's coming from the main that doesn't have lead or copper in it. If you've used the restroom, or if you've taken a shower, or if you've done that, then water has come from the main, and you might need to flush out a little bit just to get out what's been in that faucet. But keeping that in mind will help you, whether it's with lead and copper or any kind of water quality that you're observing in your home. If you want to conserve water, because people want to conserve water, and I think that's great, you can, once you've run that for 2 or 3 minutes, fill up a water jug, put it in the refrigerator, and then use that for your drinking water throughout the day. The other key thing is using cold water. Do not use hot water for drinking or eating or making baby formula. Lead and copper dissolves more easily into hot water. So if you are filling up a pot to boil, I know a lot of people do hot water just because they think it's going to boil faster. That's not the best idea. Use the cold water and start with the water that has the less potential for lead and copper in it. Boiling water will not remove lead and copper. The other thing to keep in mind is that plumbing fixtures, like I said, that's where you can get lead and copper that is coming into the water. And so in June of 1986, homes were required to have, it wasn't lead-free, but it was less lead, so not more than 8% lead in their plumbing as of June 1986. But since January of 2014, there is a new regulation that it has to be certified as lead-free. And to be lead-free, it can't contain more than 0.25% lead. This is important because in this day and age of DIY, do-it-yourself improvements, and you can buy anything from online, make sure if you're buying plumbing and fixtures online, make sure they're certified lead-free. There's a picture on there. A lot of them will have LF on it, and that means lead-free. So make sure your plumbing contains that. If you're using a licensed plumber, they have to use lead-free plumbing when they're doing work in your home. So take a look at your plumbing materials, and that could tell you if you're susceptible to issues with lead and copper, and then you can take those precautions accordingly. So if you're still concerned after we've discussed all this, or if you're at risk, there's a couple things you can do further. You can put a filter on the faucet you use for drinking and cooking. There are filters out there. You have to make sure that they're certified for lead and copper, and you have to make sure you follow the maintenance and replace those filters They're not that expensive. I've seen ones out there, they're about $30. So the other thing you can do is use bottled water. It's not necessary, but again, it's a precaution people can take if they feel they're at risk. So one thing I did want to touch on, and I know you guys have stayed with me quite a bit here. I don't have that much longer to go through this, but there are primary and secondary drinking water standards. And this is important to clarify the difference between them, because primary drinking water standards have maximum contaminant levels. They are enforceable standards. The village samples for these contaminants and submits those samples to IEPA. And a violation notice is then issued if the village exceeds those MCLs. So this includes coliform, disinfection byproducts, disinfectants, inorganic chemicals, organic chemicals, and radionuclides. So those are the ones that have health effects. They are regulated, they're enforceable. You also have secondary drinking water standards that establishes water quality standards it's actually for 15 contaminants. They're non-mandatory and they're not enforceable, but they address aesthetic considerations such as taste, odor, and color. They are not health threatening. So that's why they're in the secondary contaminants list. And this includes color, corrosivity, iron, manganese, sulfate, and total dissolved solids. And that's only 6 of the 15. There's 9 others in there. But they're not health threatening. If they are present, they're not going to impact you. It's fine to drink the water. And just making that clarification is key, because I think people see, if they see a cloudy water or they see water with color, they think something's wrong with it. It's still safe to drink. So now we'll go into some of the additional steps the village has taken to improve the water quality. So in addition to the CCA improvements, the village performs distribution system flushing. I'm sure you guys have seen this as they're working hard to flush the system. They've done this twice a year, in the spring and the fall, and the flushing was last completed in May of 2017. So the flushing program was developed originally in 2014, and CMT actually developed the flushing program. It's based on using hydraulic modeling to achieve a scouring velocity in the pipes of at least 5 feet per second. And I say scouring velocity, the best correlation I can give to you is when you're washing dishes and you have a glass with caked on stuff on it, and you turn the faucet all the way on to try to get that off. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're cranking up the velocity in the mains in order to scour the inside of the pipes. And achieving the scouring velocity removes sediments from the pipes and improves water quality and the chlorine residual. And so that's what the village is doing twice a year in this flushing. So the village is also monitoring chlorine residuals in the system to determine when the chlorine burn needs to be done. And this past flushing cycle, a chlorine burn was performed. They switched to free chlorine and then flushed in order to clean the distribution system. So in the future, the village will continue to meet the milestones associated with the compliance commitment agreement and the copper action level exceedance. We went through those earlier. Nitrification and chlorine residuals in the distribution system will continue to be monitored. And then if nitrification is present, the village will do a chlorine burn and followed by flushing, similar to what they did in this April and May a couple months ago. And then the system-wide flushing will be performed at least annually, and likely still twice a year, to keep that distribution system clean, to scour those pipes. So we do maintain those chlorine residuals in the distribution systems, not only close to the plant, but at the outskirts of the system. So with that, that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Teresa. At this time, we'll take questions. I don't know if Brad, if you want to come up here.
There's only one.
Perfect. So we don't need that. If yeah. So we'll be fine. We were anticipating a little more crowd and potentially a lot more people to speak, so I wanted to prioritize that. But we have an hour and 15 minutes, so I think we'll have plenty of time if anyone wants to speak tonight. So with that, if I could have a show of hands of who wants to address us from the podium. If you come up there, if you just state your name. We don't need your address, any more information, but if you would state your name, we would appreciate that. So with that, do we have any questions? We'll take comments too. If you want to address us with comments, that's fine also. Do we have anybody?
Hot mic. Hi, I'm Andrea Roth. Do I need to give my address?
You don't have to
No.
give your address.
Okay,
Just name's
great.
good.
So I've talked with Craig and Bob and Dave and Steve. So hi. Thanks everyone for attending. I haven't talked to you yet, Teresa, but I will. No. So I just wanted to give a little background. I attended a meeting in 2014 that Craig had as well. So I really appreciate this time to, this was really helpful. And so I think my main concern, I guess, is just that I didn't know about the copper exceedance until recently, and so I wish I would have known about it sooner. And so I guess, that's why we have a website now. So maybe would this presentation be shared on that webpage?
Yes, so the videotape of tonight's meeting, it will actually be available through the website on YouTube, and it will actually be on the TV, and then we will put this, the PowerPoint presentation via PDF on our website.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay. And so the other thing I want to add to that is just the EPA has a lot of information. I'm sure Dave and Steve know this. So, there's just a lot to go through. And so I think it would also be great if maybe even in the Citizen Support Center section, we could put a summary of what we learned here, as well as frequently asked questions. I know our public works director loves going on Facebook and answering questions at 2 a.m. on a Monday, but if we could maybe, have...
I don't know if I enjoy it, but...
That was kind of a joke.
No, I appreciate it.
But you enjoy being flooded with questions. No, that's another water joke. Okay. I'm here all night. But mainly, it would save your time and be real super efficient if we had a PDF that maybe said frequently asked questions, and it had what are tannins. I didn't know what they were until we started getting into this, and so that's another organic contaminant besides the biofilm that's in our water and naturally occurring besides the ammonia. See how much we've learned? This is crazy. And biofilm, that's a new word, right? So if it explained those things, and if you have yellow water, it could be. If you have brown water, it could be. And then tips to explain what to do, like the great tips that you shared, where you flush your water for 3 minutes. But it's going to be different depending on what's going on with your water, right? So if it's tannins, that's a different. Flushing is still an option. But my point is there's a lot going on that we didn't talk about tonight. That would be great to not have to go to Facebook, because that's a temporary thing. It goes away. And then people don't, if they didn't see the post, they're not going to know. Same with the newspaper article. They're not going to know if they read it once or if they don't get the paper. So anyway, but of course, everyone should call. That's important, right? Call the village and report your problems. But if you're, like I said, if it's 2 a.m. or whatever time and you can't call the village, then that's when the PDF would be helpful too.
Andrea,
Yeah.
you can call the village at 2 a.m.
Oh, really?
The police department has an emergency number, And if it is deemed to really be necessary.
Sure.
We have call-outs.
Mm-hmm.
Paul has a guy on call, I have a man
Sure.
on call.
Okay.
Street department, call the police department on that number.
Sure.
We're
Well,
not-
I mean, I guess
Don't hesitate to
that's,
call.
oh,
on
sure. Oh, that's
anything.
good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah.
But I guess my thing is, it's not, if you call, that's great, but the person answering at that time might not know what to tell you. And so, you know what I mean? Like, they could say, we have a great PDF on our site, and that can give you the information to troubleshoot what's going on, but they might not be necessarily trained to troubleshoot like Craig is. You know what I mean? So that's
And I think
the
what
thing.
Bob's saying is if you call dispatch, and I understand where you're at, but if you call dispatch for anything public works, that's a gas emergency, a water
Oh,
emergency,
yeah.
whatever. If you call dispatch, you will get a qualified person
Okay.
from that department
Okay.
available 24/7, 365.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And definitely for your records too, we should do that, because that way, because you're keeping track of where these things are happening and when they're happening, which is so important as we go through this process.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We do have a database, so we do, even through the flushing, we're monitoring everything, years of data. That's going to Teresa. They're looking at it, but when we get a complaint, a call, discolor water, whatever that is, we do log that in a database, so that we can at least isolate and identify areas that may be a potential concern.
Okay, so now I want to get into this. So I briefly, mentioned this when you were talking, and this is the annual water quality consumer confidence report that is for 2016, which is linked on our website now, which is great. However,
And I do have some copies in the back.
Okay.
By the sign up, if anyone wants to grab one, they
yeah,
are back there.
and this isn't some. I just want to be clear. This is something more that the EPA provides, and you, Bob, and you both plug in the information.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
And so,
It's a template, basically.
yeah, and so I know I'm going to write a letter to my congressmen and women about this, so I'm going to get into it now. If I were going through and trying to figure out the status of my water, this report is hard to read, and it doesn't really tell me. Like, in your presentation, you mentioned that if there's a sample testing and it goes over, then there's a violation. But that didn't happen for copper. Can we explain why that didn't happen?
It's not an MC. Oh, well, you go ahead.
Yeah, the lead and copper are not MCLs.
Okay.
Okay, they have no maximum contaminant level. Lead and copper rule is a treatment technique rule. And so the original, in 1991, the idea of the lead and copper rule was that you would go and sample throughout the distribution system, and then that gives you a concept of water quality and whether or not your water supply is making a corrosive water for either lead or copper.
Right.
So the numbers that you see are really, for lack of a better term, they're contrived numbers that somebody in 1991 decided were good numbers to indicate whether water was corrosive for lead and copper.
You mean the action level number?
The action level, and that's a good term to use because it is an action level. It's not an MCL. So it's a treatment technique. So it's not reported as an MCL on that
Okay.
consumer confidence
Okay.
report.
So then that takes me back to the village, okay? So because that's not something that is a violation where that would trigger an automatic notification to the public, that's where I feel like we do need that kind of information on the website. So we know all of those things that you shared and we can protect ourselves and our health, because everyone has different health issues, and being aware of that is good, right? And so that's where, because it's not a triggered communication, yeah, so that's why I wanted to point that out. While we were exceeding the action level for copper, there was no really notification sent out publicly. And that's where the concern is, I guess, on my part. And this, it doesn't explain why we were exceeding copper, what we're doing to mitigate it, and that's just the way the report is. So again, my congressman's going to hear about it, but I just want to point that out. If we're using this to help people understand water, it's not going to give them the information they really need to fully understand it. Is what I wanted to explain.
Hey, can I
Yeah.
speak just a second? Just so you know, that report isn't Morton's fault.
No, right, that's what I'm saying.
And so everybody understands.
Yep.
The language in that consumer confidence report is prescribed by US EPA. All
Right.
those, every one of those terms, because Illinois EPA is the primacy agent for that rule, we have to stick to their
Sure.
template, regardless
Sure.
of how idiotic it may be.
I didn't say that.
Well, I have publicly before. So, I mean, it's a very difficult report to understand. However, they're stuck with it.
Right.
So, to your point, there's nothing that precludes them from doing another summary
Okay.
of that report
Yes.
with their own language.
Excellent.
And,
Yep.
I'm sure Craig would be willing to do that.
Definitely.
Yep. And I know the village is working hard, obviously. Like, shows, right? We're getting there. This didn't happen overnight, so we can't expect it to be fixed overnight. It's like moving a dinosaur, right? When you turn one thing, you have to figure out what's going to be impacted and then fix that. So I understand it's a process. So, but getting to that, I guess that's why I think it's important to share the information as well. Because if it's a long process and we're tweaking things, this report does share, that it's important to get the public input as we're going through things and changing things. So I know with Oracle, when that was added, I didn't know until after it was added. And so I would just appreciate, as a consumer of the water, to know maybe a little, if we could know beforehand and have that discussion more of what's going to change. Like if we do go from sodium silicate to orthophosphates, how is our water quality going to change? What's that going to impact? What can we expect? And so I know Craig loves my phone calls. So, but
Those are good comments.
thank you. So that's really what I wanted to make sure I understood. And the other thing is, like, looking at this report, the halocetic acids, which is one of my concerns, it does say our highest level detected was 65, and the MCL is 60. But I just wanted to clarify, it's not a violation. It doesn't tell me the average. So all I know is the highest level detected from this report. So that's another thing, is if we could have that kind of information, like what is the quality of our water overall? Where's our halocetic acids? That's the disinfection byproducts. Where's that at overall? So was that over, or was that just the highest level detected? Do you know the average?
I'm going to let Trent, if you can, speak to that.
We sample that twice a year, I believe, right,
Okay.
Dave?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have 65 was a high one. We had one come back way low. So yeah, but I agree it'd be good to basically just give you everything that we get back from
Not just me, like everybody.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
But from PDC Labs that actually does the testing. We don't test for that. We just send that off to the EPA accredited lab. So yeah, I agree. That's a very good point.
And that MCL is based on a locational running annual average. And so you can have one sample that's out of compliance and it doesn't trigger a violation notice because it's based on a locational running annual average.
But do you see how that's kind of confusing to the public consumer?
Well-
It's like, what?
And MCLs are confusing, period. It doesn't matter whether it's HAAs or trihalomethanes
Yeah.
or whether it's chlorides or whatever or any other organic. So explaining maybe how an MCL is calculated, we can help you put that out on a site too, because it's saying running annual average doesn't really mean anything if you don't know that that's 4
Right.
times a year or
Right.
2 times a year or
Right, and I know the protocol's different for testing those halocetic acids versus testing for copper and lead.
Correct.
And then more changes are coming, right? With our lead and copper, they're probably going to be separating those out. So that's coming as well. So more changes, So it's just, I get it. It's an evolving thing. There's lots of moving parts. But like I said, I just would love it if we had more of that accessible information, and then it will help us be more engaged as citizens, be more plugged in, and know what's going on. And then maybe I can't promise that will stop the Facebook post, but at least it will help, and then people will start, educating each other. So
Thank you, Andy.
thank you.
Yeah. And in regards to the Facebook post, I have been on some sites. I have notified the trustees of what I'm doing as far as representing the village. I think sometimes, I've felt the need to get some informed information out there. We have had a difficult time of people still calling. I do not get a lot of phone calls at Village Hall. And I try to stress that we want your calls. We had one actually this week where I posted, luckily I knew that individual and I knew where he lived. My guys, Jason and Trent, were there at, I believe, 7:30 that morning. I met them over there. We flushed the main. We talked to him. We handled it. But the only way that was done that quickly is because I knew who he was and where he lived. So I can't stress enough to please call us. We want your calls. We want to know what's going on. With that, do we have any other questions, comments?
Hello, my name is Megan Rapp. I recently became concerned about high copper in our water after the tests from my home came back almost 3 times over the EPA's action level. Now people are aware, so I don't, but the action level for copper is 1.3 milligrams per liter and my home was 4.52. After my test came back high, I was informed by the village that they had been exceeding the EPA's designated copper level as a whole since the beginning of 2016. I don't think that I'm alone when I say that I hadn't heard or read any information on the Morton website or any type of public notice in regards to the high copper. I started reading more and putting together some numbers and learned that according to Mayo Clinic, the normal daily recommended intake for copper for children under the age of 3 is 0.4 to 1 milligram per liter, and it gradually increases with age from 1.5 to 3 milligrams per liter per day for an average adult. Most of the sample sites that exceeded the copper level in 2016 still continue to test over the action level, not all of them, and obviously not quite as high. But that more than likely means that I also had high copper in my house in 2016. That was especially concerning for my young daughters, as my youngest was a baby in 2016. I then decided to calculate the copper nutrient level for my children and found that after 1 8-ounce bottle of formula or water, my daughter would have exceeded the recommended daily intake for copper. I also wish I would have been aware of the high copper in my water when I was pregnant, as pregnant women are instructed to drink a lot of water all the time, and I would have made sure that it was within my doctor's guidelines and recommendations. I also have concerns about high copper because I have an autoimmune disorder, and a heavy metal like high copper can exacerbate symptoms. I know everyone has their own health concerns, but all in all, I just really wish that I would have known so that I could have protected myself and my family. I'm thankful that it was shared earlier in the meeting, all the different types of things that people can do to protect themselves, but that should have been, in my opinion, that should have been shared immediately after we exceeded that level, because it's now a year later. And it's great that we've learned that, but there's been a year that's passed that I think a lot of people would have been concerned and had concerns if they would have known. If the lead and copper levels exceed action levels, I think the water suppliers should educate their consumers on how to reduce exposure, which we did, but that would be great, like Andrea had stated, to make it more readily available. I think if it's easily accessible on the website and talked about even more in public settings or in newspaper articles or anything else that's put out by the village, it can just make the community, it gives them the ability to make the best decisions for their own health. So I have 2 questions. I have one for the EPA. Have you dealt with other water systems in the region that have exceeded the action level in copper? And if so, was it a long-term process, or how long did it continue to go on?
As a rule of thumb, any lead and copper issue is a long-term process. I mean, as Andrew described, generally it's at least a 2 to 3 year process to figure out exactly what you need to do to optimize your corrosion control treatment. So yes, it's.
Are there other ones around us that have that problem too, or no?
Well, I can't think of anybody with a copper issue close by.
I can't, not close.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
nothing comes to mind, I'm
Okay.
sorry.
Okay, hold on just a second. Okay, so then I guess my other questions, the rest of them are for the village. Whoever wants to answer them. Okay, so one of the copper sample sites, the highest one, was 53 Blackberry Court in Morton, and that one was tested at 6.9. Is that the highest level that's been recorded in Morton, or is that, I mean, we only have a certain number of sample sites, I realize, that we test, but I would assume you probably do other testing throughout the village.
I'm going to let Trent or Bob finish that, but just to be clear, even with your specific situation, I appreciate your comments, I respect them, but the sample that we're talking about at Megan's was from her contacting us and doing a special sample. But with our 60 samples, with that question.
That was the highest one, yeah. We do sample the 60 sites twice yearly. When people call, like you called me, I came out, got a sample. I always do run copper. That's just one of the things that I do now. That was the highest one that I've ever seen, the 53 Blackberry Court. But yeah, I mean, we do sample for it, and I mean, we're trying to fix it.
I did want to point out, which it was fine. I mean, I ended up getting the information, but like the first time we did it, it was flushed. So I think people should, it would be important. And I realize it's worst case scenario is from the pipes, but especially with children and babies, like you do make bottles in the middle of the night, and when people don't know that, like that's bothersome to me. So I guess I just wanted to point out, like, it would be. I don't know if all of them are tested at first run. I assume they're not, but people should know that.
Well, like with yours, our first initial test, when I let the water run,
Right.
the copper was 0.62. That's milligrams per liter.
Right.
So that would be 620
Yeah.
parts
Well, we
per
did
billion.
it twice.
We did it twice,
Yeah.
but I came back, I gave you that bottle
Right.
for the first draw, and then that's when it came back high. So that's kind of proof right there
Well,
that,
one of them was 6. One of them was that. We actually did 2. You actually did 2 with it being flushed. It doesn't really matter. But the second one was like 1.1
Okay.
that you did
Okay, I
with
got
the
that.
water being flushed.
okay.
And then at that point is when I had asked about getting it done first run. So it doesn't matter. It does matter if people are asking to get it done to obviously just know the worst case scenario. And I appreciate you guys. Trent especially did an awesome job at providing answers for me and answering all my questions. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I've also been in contact with Craig in the village and whatnot about some of the sample sites that were for lead and copper. Can you explain to them how it's going to be changing recently?
I don't even know if you guys are aware of this yet. I think we talked briefly. But the sample sites we're talking about, the 60 sample sites, we actually had alternates in there too. Were done back in 91, 92. They're the same ones today. A majority of those were tier 1. There's a certain percentage, 50% of those have to be lead. Or in the tier 1, we've pretty much confirmed that we don't have lead in the system. So, and we appreciate working with you. It's a discussion I had with Megan about that, and we're working with the APA to look at those and revise those sample sites potentially going forward. If that's if the EPA and the village. We're good sampling at whatever is the most effective place. I think the sampling that was done historically, I don't know that there was any problem with that. The unfortunate thing is when you're trying to identify lead services, it's very difficult to know where that lead service is. I assume that was done back in 91, assuming that there were lead services out there, of which there are not today. So we are reviewing those as we speak. I would anticipate within the next month or so, we would look to revise some of those sites to update some of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 to make sure we meet that going forward with the information that we know today. With that, I will add, and Paul's been here for quite some time. He is one of the gentlemen that is always like, Craig, there's no lead. I've been doing this for how many years? There's no lead. And going back to Lon Barkdahl, we've had the two superintendents since the late 70s, since I was born. So, you know, they're the ones crying out. The thing to keep in mind too is Morton, we redo our water mains. So it's an active replacement plan. A lot of these sample sites were confirmed to not have lead, you know, over a 15-year period where every single main in front of those sites was replaced by the Village of Morton. So at that time, we were able to notice and document the service line as we connected it to the curb stop. Going forward, I think it's Senate Bill 550, I believe. We're ahead of the game there with our GIS system and updating our website. We're doing those things as we speak. When Paul and his guys see what the service line is, we are updating that on our records. And we hope by, if it goes into effect, I think it's April 18, that I'm hoping we've got 80% of our entire village, the service line material, size, everything that will be accessible on our website. A lot of times when we talk about what plumbing's in our home, there's still that questionable area between the curb stop and the home. What is it? And I think that's what's going on in a lot of communities, you know, throughout Illinois and throughout this country. I think we're ahead of the game in being able to update that and give information to people as far as what their service is.
I did just want to confirm, though. I mean, the reason that you're going to be going through to readjust them is because there weren't enough sites meeting the criteria that they were supposed to be for the past, in the past.
Yes, but with that, I think the samples that were taken back, I would guess that way back when the lead and copper rule came into effect, that, you know, there was some assumptions
Right.
based on the age of the home that there
Right.
was lead. We've now confirmed that we don't
Right.
have lead, and as such, yes, I think that's a good idea to relook at that.
Right.
The one thing that I will be very cautious about is, while we want to get sites properly tiered and classified, the goal of the lead and copper rule, again, was to identify corrosive water. And whether or not the sites were tiered properly or not, we identified corrosive water. So the intent of the rule was met by the fact we found corrosivity.
When
Now,
are you talking about? The 2016 found corrosive, or when are you?
When I'm talking about the copper exceedance that
The copper
was
exceedance,
in
okay.
2016. So,
Okay.
so I also, while they redo their lead and copper rule, we're going to want to retain some of those
Right.
sites.
Oh, I
I don't
agree.
care. I
Yeah.
don't care what they're classified
Right,
from
I
my
agree.
perspective.
Yeah.
We just want to maintain
Yeah.
those
And I think that's
locations.
something Megan and I have discussed in one email, that, you know, let's not get ahead of ourselves here. These sample sites are still important for the
Exactly. Well,
I
reasons
think
Dave
it's great to
mentioned we
keep-
do it.
Yeah, to keep a
So-
backlog, and, I mean, a
Historical
long-term,
inform-
yes, a
historical
long-term
information
historical
is
information on it.
important.
But
Right.
I just want to make sure, my concern is that we came in 2016 and tested over for copper in 2016, but had we had other sites, hopefully we wouldn't have. I mean, right? We don't know. There's no way to go back and guess. But I just want to make sure that that in the future, you know, that we're getting enough sites that will show it
And
well, because who knows what it was prior to 2016 exactly.
And with changes to the lead and copper rule, and I think I may have discussed this with you on the phone maybe.
Oh, I haven't talked with you. Maybe it was.
I can't remember I'm getting old. I can't remember who I talked to. But, you know, I would hope that US EPA will also factor in geographic information. I mean, especially for older communities. For example, Galesburg was in the news. If you look at Galesburg's monitoring, it's all clustered. I mean, there's no geographic spread to that data. So while we're focused on making sure of these tiers,
Right.
I'm also concerned about geography and making sure that we're representing whole communities.
I agree. I had that
And with these-
conversation with him as
yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yeah, with these sites, we'll want to make
Yeah,
sure.
because there were some that were in a small location, and I
Yeah.
think it'd be great to.
And
to be able to
again,
do
that was probably because they thought that's where their
Lead,
highest
yeah.
likelihood for lead was
lead.
going to be.
And that is, I'm not standing here saying that copper is more toxic than lead. That's silly.
Right.
It's not.
Right.
But I just,
And the other thing to keep in mind, as we put in Tier 1, I agree with you, but even the way the rule states, as I put in Tier 1 sites that have copper with leaded solder, that's 82 to 86. That was a down economy in Morton, and I've only got 21 of those sites. So, and those are going to be geographically clustered as a result, so we may still be in the same position based on how those tiers are set up.
right.
Yeah, and for purposes of lead and copper, we'll deal with that, but then I think there's also opportunities outside of the rule to make sure we get that geographic
Yeah.
spread.
Agreed.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Meg. Do we have any other questions, comments from the audience?
It's
Ken.
going to be a little more informal session, but just a few questions, if I could. Copper, is there an MCL for copper?
No.
No. And why would that be?
I think it's because to develop an MCL, it's a very detailed process that US EPA has to go through in order to collect data, analyze various issues, including treatability, and then, you know, the toxicity studies, et cetera, that have to be conducted to show health effects related to the MCL.
Right. MCLs were originally, the MCLs that exist are all based on some related toxicity, health issues, things that are pretty well known. And even at that, those MCLs, when they're developed, I'm not familiar with the exact numbers, but my understanding is that they're based on consumption of some pretty good volumes of water on a daily basis. Do you remember the numbers?
No.
I mean, we're talking about many liters of water.
Yes, it's,
Liters over like 70 years.
yeah,
Yeah.
for a long, yeah, for,
For a long time.
for chronic,
For basically
chronic.
for a lifetime.
Correct,
And then there's a factor of safety.
correct.
They probably took the number and then divided by 10 to develop the MCL. So I guess the point
For
I'm
most
trying to
contaminants,
make
yeah.
here, I guess to the public, is again, copper, there's not an MCL, which I think is pretty good evidence that, I mean, if there's any concern, the EPA is going to come up with a number. I mean, pretty much. I mean, from a health standpoint.
From a health-based standpoint, generally, EPA will prioritize contaminants.
Mm-hmm.
So if this one has been monitored since 1991 in a distribution system, I'm not aware of them having the data to develop an MCL.
Right. And most of your MCLs were developed back in 76, 77 when the Safe Drinking Water Act came into being.
Well, a lot of the more chronic ones, yes.
Yeah.
The more acute contaminants, you know, phase 2, 5, organics.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm talking the inorganics.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So again, the point is, I think that I want to make to the public is because we exceed the action level, I don't think that really means we have water that's unsafe as far as the copper is concerned. Now, granted, there may be particular issues with individuals, but even at that, and I hate to dispute your numbers, Megan, I don't know what your calculations are, but I think you might be mixing milligrams per liter with maybe milligrams intake per body weight or something, but they don't work out. I mean, when you're talking about, 4 or 5 milligrams per liter of copper in your drinking water, you'd have to drink an awful lot of water. Even an infant would have to ingest an awful lot of that water to exceed.
Like 33 ounces is a liter, maybe 33, 34 ounces is a liter. So, and so then just the equivalent. So then I just said 8 ounces, like an 8-ounce bottle. So that's how I got my number. I mean,
Yeah, but that, the effect is, the health effect is based on a mass, body mass, I would assume, not just an intake. If you, in other words, if you drink, 2 liters of water and you're taking in, 6 milligrams of copper into somebody with a body weight of 20 pounds, I mean, is there going to be a toxic or even a health effect there? I guess that's the question I haven't.
That is the question. That's my question.
But again, I think the point is that I'm trying to make is our water is not. I mean, I don't think there's anything to panic about here, as far as the copper action level. Again, I just want to make that point. And then I guess a question getting back. And I'm learning. I could probably just ask this to Bob on the side, but again, I just bring it out to the public. Your chlorination. Do you break point?
We only break pointed this year because we didn't have the ability to, until this year, to reach the break point.
To even reach break point?
Yes. When we got the new equipment in, we started break pointing 4 or 5 days before the flush started. Yep. We had quite a few blips in it. Trent worked very hard to get it right, and we break pointed for 6 weeks. Yeah. And we finally, Paul reached a point in his flushing program, and we said, okay, enough. And then we dropped it off.
Let me say something, Ken, before you go on. I bet there's a lot of people that don't know what break point is.
I thought Teresa did a fabulous job of getting that.
Okay.
Or close to it anyway.
So, I mean, if that's the case, then I'll shut my mouth.
The one thing that Teresa did say, 4 to 5 parts more of chlorine. It takes 10 parts of chlorine to get rid of 1 part of ammonia. To reach the break point, we had to feed 35.
We're right around 30 to 35 parts to combat the 3 parts that we get coming out of the ground of ammonia.
The ammonia is about 3 parts.
2.5 to 3, roughly.
We were going through. Normally, we'll go through 50 pounds of chlorine a day at the most. We were going through 300 pounds of chlorine a day to reach the break point and to maintain it.
Right.
And from 300 to 400 pounds. I don't have the figures in front of me, but it was an awesome amount of chlorine.
And then once you reached break point, you went beyond and were carrying some free.
We were carrying free out of the plants, free only, yes.
And what free were you carrying out of the plants?
We tried to stay around 2 parts.
Around 2 free.
2 parts free, yeah. And right now, since we've gone back, we're running 3.5 to 4.5 parts combined chlorine, chloramines, chloramination. Trent's trying to stabilize it right at 4 for all 3 plants. And you know as well as anybody, trying to stabilize 3 different plants the same is very difficult.
Very difficult.
And, we'll stay with it till we get it right because of the new equipment we have.
And when you're at that point, what is your raw ammonia coming out of the plant after? Well, maybe even downstream a little bit after reaction.
It's about 1.5 parts leaving the plant. Our softeners do take some of it out. What we find is when our softeners are nearing the end of their regeneration cycle, they start to kind of dump it into the water, so we can see spikes in the ammonia at certain times, but we try to do a good job of keeping those softeners regenerated with fresh salt for the zeolite.
Right.
And the point there also is not all the water is treated with the softeners.
Right.
Right.
So a part of that ammonia is naturally from the wells themselves that's not being softened.
Yeah.
So it's a not an easy calculation.
Right. Right. And I guess just where I'm going with this is, would you consider break point, or just getting to break point to heat up your ammonia?
Ahead
I
of
know
the
it's a lot of
softeners.
chlorine.
Yeah,
It's a lot of money.
Well, it's a lot of money, but
And I think that gets into that next stage. If we find nitrification becomes too much of an issue to
on
deal
the
with,
system.
or there's continuous positive coliform samples, we would look at additional treatment. And one of the additional treatments could be breakpoint chlorination all the time. But the CCA improvements allow that to take place.
Unfortunately, timing is our issue to meet the CCA, but that was something that was discussed in detail even with the EPA, is kind of where we still got to go is the long-term treatment options.
Yeah.
In addition,
That's a good point.
one of the other things that we've discussed is biologically active filtration too as an alternative, which may be more economical than trying to burn it up on the front end.
There was a lot of those looks over here,
Yeah.
but the more we got into it, it was,
Yeah.
It's a possibility.
maybe that's an option.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially if cost and those things come into it. I think that
Okay.
has to play into it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Nope.
Ken. Any other questions, comments from the audience? All right, hearing none, I think some of us were 7:30, will be available. If any of you want to come up here afterwards, I know all these 6 people I'm with are more than willing to answer any questions that you have, and myself too. I hope this was informative to all of you. I think with some of the questions from Andrea and Megan, those are things with the website. It's challenging this year. I sent a blue flyer out in the utility bills. I know not everybody looks at that, but when our website was hacked, we felt that was the best option to at least get to everybody prior to our flush. We may still do some of that in the future, so I encourage you, if you see a colored paper, yellow is gas, blue is water, please look at that in your utility bill. It may be helpful information to you. So with that, this concludes the meeting. Thank you.